Thank you for joining us again and welcome back to Chatsworth as we continue on the journey of the stories of the house and the collection it contains.
In the last episode, we discovered that architecture was an enduring interest for many of those who have lived and worked at Chatsworth. In this episode, we come back to the building and its landscape to see how the house and the land surrounding it were changed and adapted over the years to reflect new political and social realities, as well as changing fashion.
So Alex, what I've always been really struck with when I look at this painting by Thomas Smith is that we have no sort of designs from this period. So this is our only glimpse into this sort of early 18th century landscape. And my understanding before I really looked into it was that nothing really changed from the formal gardens of the first Duke until the fourth Duke brought Capability Brown in. But actually there's a lot of change happening here in the time of the third Duke and has obviously happened in the time of the second Duke because it's a lot less formal. There's a simplification coming. And although I know some of the structures are still there, there is a real sense of this idea of more of a landscape.
So this painting dates to the early 1740s. It's in the time of the third Duke. And already here we can see that there's a lot less of those highly patterned parterre gardens here. We can see a lot more of these open lawns in the landscape. There's still some of areas where there are these walled gardens and still the old stable block here quite close to the west front of the house. And it would be 20 years until these elements were swept away, including the bridge and indeed the course of the river changing. But at this moment, halfway, as you say, between the formal and then the Capability Brown landscape, we've got this much more united garden and landscape vista. So you've got the sense of the house, not just within its own garden, but within this much bigger, more expansive view.
The landscape architect Lancelot Capability Brown's work at Chatsworth came early in his career, but his approach and style were already by then clearly defined. At Chatsworth, Brown did not make the huge transformations he is often credited with at other estates. Rather, he was part of an almost 100-year evolution away from the French and Dutch-inspired formal gardens of the late 17th century to the less formal and natural designs of the 18th. This involved the dissolving of the boundaries between garden and park, including the diverting of roads, planting of trees, and the widening of the river to create a more picturesque and visible watercourse. In tandem with this were new buildings, bridges, stables, a mill, and all in all the landscape setting became a more considered and deliberate backdrop for the house. So Alex, we're looking at some of the work of James Payn, who was brought in 1759 as part of a sort of naturalisation of the estate, very much sort of the coming of the picturesque. So some of these drawings, what are we looking at here?
We're looking at drawings of work made by James Payn, and you're right, this is completely a change in the kind of philosophy really of how your house sits within the landscape, and it is that connection between the house and not just a garden but the landscape beyond. So Payn was designing for the fourth Duke a series of buildings and functional architecture in the landscape, but as much as functional, it was also very much about seeing the house from these structures and the way in which these things related to the house in the landscape.
So framing views as such.
Framing views, but also paying more attention to the views from the house as well. So this three-arched bridge, which was designed by Payn and has in this drawing sculptures on it that were relocated from the garden from the first Duke's time. These are sculptures by Cibber. So creating this quite beautiful structure to cross the river in a new way, and the bridge itself is angled so that when you're on the bridge you get this fantastic view of Chatsworth sitting within the landscape. And also from the house, when you look at the river and this bridge crossing it, it's also at the kind of optimum angle for this kind of picturesque view of the landscape beyond the house. And he's also designing quite a significant building, which is just kind of up the hill from the house.
The stables.
So here are two pictures of the stables at Chatsworth, which again is a building that's still here, still very much part of the Chatsworth experience. They're Palladian in style, and that's a really good point to mention because, of course, the 4th Duke's father-in-law was 3rd Earl Burlington, and he was responsible for bringing Palladianism to that period of time. And the stables were built for 80 horses, carriages, there was a grain store, accommodation for the people who were looking after the horses, and they were built on a quadrangle so that the horses could be exercised within that space, within its walls.
And you were telling me earlier a lovely sort of story about the possible continuation of craftsmen who've worked both in the house and on these new buildings.
That's right. So we do know that slightly later than the date of the stables, there was some additional carving made for this pediment in the centre by a chap called Henry Watson, and we think that that is the grandson of Samuel Watson, who was carving in the house for the 1st Duke.
Well, that's just a lovely sort of continuation, isn't it, of that sort of talented people that worked on all of the structures and the house. So Alex, we're really fortunate in the archive that we have this beautiful little working notebook of Geoffrey Wyatville. And I think why I find this so extraordinary, that when he's brought in by the 6th Duke to look at the work that Thomas Paine had done on this north extension, we don't have previously any images of it. This is the first time I've actually ever seen this sort of 3 sort of structured like north extension. So this is an amazing sort of point to be marked in history.
That's right. So what Wyatville's doing here before he undertakes any new work is recording what already exists. And this north wing design here, as you say, it's the only image that we have of what it looked like before the 6th Duke's extension. It almost looked like 3 residences next to each other. Very symmetrical, very beautiful. But helpfully then, above this, what Wyatville does is shows the plan. And onto that plan, he's marked what the function is of each of these rooms. So we have kitchen, pantry, laundry, stores, and so on. So all the services are needed to facilitate the actions of a house like Chatsworth. And it's just so brilliant to see what that would have looked like before the 6th Duke kind of gets his hands on this part of the house and changes some of the function of what happens there.
But it does also show that it was building on an existing footprint.
That's right, yes. I think sometimes we think of Chatsworth remaining as that kind of quadrangle around the inner court without anything else around it, but of course it wasn't. There was always some activity to the north of the house.
So Alex, these sets of architectural drawings by Geoffrey Wyatville are from 1818, and this is a really interesting moment for Chatsworth. So we've got here a duke who has a huge accumulation of objects that he has inherited, but he's also someone who, like many of his predecessors, likes to buy, likes to commission on a grand scale. He's also living in a time when the great house party is really coming into its own. House parties required a huge setup, and luckily the Duke of Devonshire had this large estate where he could provide shooting, fishing, hunting, entertainments, balls, theatre productions. But what he needed was actually to create those spaces. In 1817, he'd been introduced to Sir Geoffrey Wyatville by the Duke of Bedford, for whom at Woburn Abbey he had just completed a sculpture gallery. And this really set him off on this journey of what was to become the North Wing.
Yeah, and these designs are fascinating, I think, because they show various iterations of how the existing buildings that were to the north of the quadrangle of Chatsworth, as we knew it, were being reimagined and remodelled in order to satisfy those needs. So here we have various ideas about how that could be realised, and I think it's fascinating because what we're seeing here is a development of the ideas and how that's going to work.
So it's beginning to look a lot more like how we know the house today. But there are some things that obviously didn't make it through to the final cut. So for example, at the end there where we see those bushes and the sort of covered walkway, that's actually where the orangery now sits. So obviously this design didn't make it entirely through.
And of course we're seeing also the east front of the kind of original
quadrangle of the house here, and what happens in the Sixth Duke's time with Wyatville is a remodelling of that east front, so it integrates with this new north wing.
And what's great as well is that we know that none of these were realised in exactly the way that we're seeing, but it shows that thought process. It shows the things that they're trying to achieve and the spaces that they hope to get in this new extension.
Here in this album of designs by Geoffrey Wyatville, we've got this plan for the north wing. And what's interesting about this plan is that it shows us how he proposes to integrate some of the previous building into his new design. So the black lines and this dotted black line here show the three kind of main pavilion type buildings of the James Payn North Wing, and then his additions are in this kind of reddy brown ink. So he's proposing kind of incorporating some of this, but then adding quite a lot of rooms here to the east of the North Wing.
And a lot of these are obviously service wings, as we can see, because obviously there's very helpful kind of, things like the lobby and the pantry and all those sort of things. And what I find particularly interesting about this entire album is how many ideas are coming through. This is an album of what could have been, what is, and what was never realised. So as we move through these series of rooms on the North Wing, we're going to see some of the spaces that was created by the Sixth Duke, both to host the lavish entertainment that he undertook, but also the areas that he stored, displayed and enjoyed his vast collections.
So if we think about the quadrangle of the house that we've now become quite familiar with, we're in the northeast corner, and then from that corner we'll progress northwards on the footprint of buildings that had existed before. So the library is still within the quadrangle of the house that we've talked about a lot, and then from the library we then have a few rooms that kind of interconnect. We have the ante-library. It has a piano in that space which is contemporary, but it kind of speaks to the fact that there would have been music that kind of enlivened these spaces. We then move into the dome room before we get to the great dining room.
And the Great Dining Room is a really special place at Chatsworth. It's still used to this day. One of the earliest uses, which is heavily documented, is Princess Victoria, later Queen Victoria's visit in 1832, where she actually had one of her first sort of public dinners as a grown-up. It's lovely that this space is still used today for dinners.
But the architecture itself is very much of its time and the Sixth Duke's vision for this space. Then moving through another vestibule space, and then we move into the sculpture gallery, which is a whole different kind of space again. It's a stone space, and it was purpose built for the Sixth Duke's collection of contemporary sculpture.
Yes, and I think that really speaks to the sort of amalgamation of things which is reaching its zenith during the Sixth Duke's time. He's not only the sort of looking after a collection which he has inherited, he's adding to it. This gallery, which contains many amazing works by Canova, was actually purpose-built to house this collection. In 2009, we're incredibly fortunate that Charles Noble, our Curator of Fine Arts, did a research project on the original positioning of the Sixth Duke's sculpture within this gallery and returned a lot of the works to their original positions. So what you see now is very close to what the Sixth Duke would have seen in his day.
You move then into the orangery, which is a space filled with light, and really for me it shows this interface between the house and the garden. And in the Sixth Duke's time, this space would have been filled with plants and sculpture and water, and it would have been this moment really before you could have chosen to exit into the garden itself.
When you're up on the roof like this, which is such a special experience because not many people get to come up here, I'm always struck again by the level of detail and craftsmanship that not only went into the making of this house, but also during the master plan. We know that over 12 tennis courts worth of lead was reapplied to the roof, but it's so beautiful and clean and crisp, and you just know that it's going to perform its job right.
Yes, the detail and the craftsmanship involved in this is brilliant. And then also there are more decorative features
like the urns and finials on top of the house. And here we're up close to them and we can see the quality and the detail of the gilding that's been applied.
Yeah, I mean, just looking at the back of the west pediment is just extraordinary, not only because you get the sense of scale, but also the way in which the house faces out into the landscape is really beautiful.